My name is Clara Monroe. I'm 34 years old, and I used to be the family helper. You know the type, good with kids, always available, invisible at holidays. While my sister climbed ladders in finance and called my work cute, I was changing diapers, organizing craft drawers, and helping overstimulated toddlers fall asleep. She once told a guy at dinner, loud enough for me to hear, "Clara's just a babysitter." But she's sweet. I didn't respond. I just smiled and packed up the leftover cupcakes. 6 years later, she walked into the boardroom of an early-stage startup, accelerator pitch deck in hand, swept behind her knees, and froze when she saw me at the head of the table. I didn't say a word. I just flipped to the slide with their burn rate and looked her straight in the eye. But it didn't start there. It started with silence. In a room full of toys. I was always the background sister. The one in the corner of family photos, blinking just as the shutter clicked. The one holding someone else's coat or wiping juice from a toddler's chin while the adults toasted new jobs, new houses, new headlines. My sister Julia was the one everyone turned to. Tall, sharp, magnetic. She filled a room before she even spoke. At family dinners, she told stories that made people laugh too loudly, nod too quickly. She wore ambition like perfume. You could sense it before she even walked in. I was the opposite. Quiet, soft-spoken, always reaching for napkins and pacifiers instead of attention. My mother said I had a calming presence, which was code for being easy to overlook. From the time we were kids, Julia was the leader. In games, in school, in our parents' eyes. She won spelling bees and student government races. I collected lost pencils and gave them names. When she got accepted to a top-tier business school, the whole family went out to dinner to celebrate. When I got my certificate in early childhood development, my dad said, "That's nice," and went back to checking the wine menu. It wasn't that they were cruel. Not exactly. It was just that I was never noticed. Julia was the one they compared other people's daughters to. I was the one they asked to babysit during reunions. I said yes every time, because it was easier to say yes than to explain that I wanted more. I wasn't sure what more even looked like. I knew how to swaddle a newborn, how to calm a tantrum, how to build a Play-Doh volcano that actually held its shape. But I didn't know how to make people take me seriously. Julia would come home from college and breeze into our kitchen, dropping phrases like capital markets and corporate ladder. She always had a new internship, a new boyfriend, a new plan. I had coloring books in my tote bag and glitter stuck to my elbow. She would raise her eyebrows at my outfits, soft cardigans, sneakers, kid-proof earrings, and give me that look. The one that said, "You're sweet, but you're not in the game." The first time I heard her call me just a babysitter, we were at a family friend's engagement party. Someone had asked what I did. I opened my mouth, but Julia answered first, laughing. I remember the way her voice cut across the room, light and dismissive. I remember how my cheeks burned as people nodded, smiled awkwardly, and moved on. I said nothing, just smiled and folded a napkin into a flower shape for the centerpiece. In our family, you didn't challenge the hierarchy. Julia was the achiever, and I was the helper. That was the unspoken contract. She chased success. I held the camera. She got the speeches and applause. I got the cleanup duty and leftover cupcakes. Every holiday reinforced it. Every wedding, graduation, barbecue. She wore high heels. I carried juice boxes. But even then, somewhere deep beneath the quiet, something was beginning to stir. Not resentment, not yet, but something sharper than patience. A sense that maybe invisibility wasn't safety, it was erasure. That maybe being good with children didn't mean I lacked vision. That maybe the skills I used to soothe and coordinate and organize tiny humans could mean something beyond a line on a profile no one read. Still, I didn't act on it. I wasn't ready. I kept showing up to family events with sticker books and snacks. I let them hand me babies and say thank you without ever asking what I wanted. I listened to Julia talk about managing million-dollar accounts and thought, maybe I'm just built differently. Maybe this is enough. But at night, after the dishes were washed and the toys put away, I would open my notebook. I didn't write stories, I wrote systems, schedules, lists. I tracked behavioral patterns and logged what calmed which child. I took notes on stress points in parents' routines. I thought about the moms who forgot to eat lunch, who emailed me at midnight asking if their toddler's tantrum meant something deeper. I started to notice patterns, needs, gaps. No one else saw it as data. But I did. Julia had her spreadsheets, I had crayons and questions. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different. I didn't know then what I was building. I didn't know that the very things they dismissed would become the foundation for something they couldn't ignore. But I knew this. I wasn't going to stay the background sister forever. Even if no one saw it yet, I had already started writing a different story. One that didn't need Julia's voice to narrate it. The dinner table was too long, too glossy, and somehow always managed to reflect back exactly how small I felt. Every time we had one of those family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, engagements, it was the same. Julia at the center, radiant in some new dress she'd just picked up in Manhattan. My parents flanking her like bookends, nodding eagerly at every story she told about deals and deadlines and venture funds. I'd be somewhere near the end of the table, next to the kids or across from a distracted uncle, quietly making sure everyone had napkins or that the toddlers weren't slipping under the tablecloth and hiding. No one asked me about my work. No one asked what I was building, what I dreamed of, or whether I was tired from carrying more than anyone could see. That night, the air was heavy with wine and compliments. Julia had just landed some executive track program, and the entire conversation revolved around her promotion, her big move, her inevitable future as a partner. Someone clinked a glass and toasted to the one in the family who made it. Everyone laughed and cheered. I smiled, even raised my glass, but didn't take a sip. My stomach had already started to knot, the way it always did when I could feel myself fading into the wallpaper. It was between courses when it happened. A family friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, leaned across the table and asked what I was doing these days. His tone was polite enough, neutral, but I felt the weight of Julia's gaze before I even opened my mouth. I started to answer something vague but honest about working closely with families, developing an idea, helping with transitions. But Julia cut in. "She's just our resident babysitter," she said, smiling as she reached for the breadbasket. "Though she makes one hell of a fort." The table laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to mark the moment. I smiled too. That's what I was trained to do. I swallowed the heat rising in my throat and tucked my hands under the table to keep them from shaking. I laughed, softly, like I was in on the joke. Like it didn't sting. But it did. It always did. Because they never called her just anything. She was never just an analyst or just a manager or just someone's daughter. She was powerful, impressive, a rising star. I was just a babysitter, just a helper, just the one who made sure the kids weren't screaming while everyone else had wine and opinions. It didn't matter that I was up at 6 every morning, that I handled logistics more complex than half the project managers at Julia's firm, that I'd built systems to support overwhelmed parents, helped raise children through tantrums and trauma, coached language delays, built trust where families were falling apart. To them, it was still diapers and snack time, and to Julia, it was something beneath her. I excused myself quietly after dessert, pretending to check on the kids upstairs. I climbed the stairs slowly, holding onto the railing like I needed it. In the playroom, 2 of the youngest cousins were curled up watching a movie. One looked up at me and grinned. "Clara, can you sit with us?" he asked, patting the spot beside him on the rug. I sat, and for a moment I let myself feel everything. The humiliation, the tiredness, the simmering sense that I was being left behind not because I lacked ability, but because I refused to perform the kind of success they wanted. I was building something, but because it wasn't wrapped in jargon or cash flow charts, it didn't count. Downstairs, they were probably still talking, still passing wine and praise like currency. Julia would be glowing, she always did in those moments, and I would still be the sweet one, the soft one, the one no one took seriously because I didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't need the spotlight badly enough to fight for it. But sitting there on the floor, surrounded by forgotten socks and plush animals, I realized something. There was power here too, the kind of power they didn't understand. Because raising children takes more than patience. It takes precision, empathy, a mind that can track 50 variables at once. I was solving real problems every day, and I was beginning to see patterns, ones that no app had addressed, no service had streamlined. Parents were desperate for help that was personal, reliable, human, and no one was building that. Not yet, they didn't see me at the table. But that didn't mean I didn't belong at one. Maybe I just needed to build my own. When I did, I wouldn't need to cut anyone off mid-sentence or make a joke at their expense. I'd just let the numbers and the silence speak for themselves. There were days when I felt like I lived between nap schedules and lunch boxes, moving from one home to the next like a shadow that never asked for space. I wasn't a nanny in the traditional sense. I was a flexible caregiver, a household anchor, someone who stepped in when parents needed breathing room and structure in the same breath. Most days began before the sun rose, packing my tote with extra socks, wipes, coloring pads, and oat bars I knew the kids liked. My name was never on the front door, but I was the first person they looked for when the cereal spilled, the tantrums started, or the Lego tower fell apart. I spent my mornings with a 2-year-old named Ava, whose mother was a lawyer and whose father worked in tech and rarely made it home before bedtime. Ava had night terrors and separation anxiety, and for months I held her through sweaty naps and whispered songs she barely understood. In the afternoons, I watched twin boys who only stopped fighting if you gave them separate puzzles and sat between them like a referee made of glue and patience. Evenings belonged to a boy with sensory issues who liked things quiet and exact, and who once clung to me so tightly during a thunderstorm that I could barely breathe, but I didn't ask him to let go. Parents would come home, toss keys on the counter, and thank me like I'd watered the plants. Some were kind, some were absent, some were visibly skeptical that I had anything of value to teach their child beyond snack routines and sticker charts. Once, a mother looked me in the eyes after I helped her daughter through her first week at preschool and said, "You'd be great if you just had a little more ambition." I smiled. Of course I did. What else was there to do? In the late hours, after dinner and dishes and thankless goodbyes, I'd go home and sit at my kitchen table, barefoot, eating reheated soup, and reading every article one could find on startup case studies and business model validation. I followed female founders with quiet hunger, dissecting how they raised seed rounds and tested markets and turned side hustles into ecosystems. I watched pitch videos on mute while I sketched platform designs on the backs of grocery receipts. I didn't have a team, or funding, or even a clear outline. But I had data. Not the kind that lives in spreadsheets and investor decks yet. Mine lived in tear-stained sleeves and missed naps and desperate 11 p.m. text from parents wondering how to survive tomorrow. I had seen the gaps in the system up close. The lack of affordable, high-quality care. The burnout. The shame. The way modern parenting was a full-time job, no one was allowed to admit they hated some days. I knew what was missing, I saw what didn't exist, and I was beginning to believe I could build it. Still, I kept working. Not because I didn't believe in my ideas, but because the kids kept showing up in my dreams, and I couldn't leave them just yet. They were my heartbeat, the daily reminder that small things mattered. I watched their worlds shift because someone showed up for them, consistently, with softness and structure. I couldn't abandon that just to chase something that hadn't yet taken form. Some nights I'd fall asleep at the table, open notebook under my cheek, highlighter caps lost under the fridge. Some mornings I'd cry in the shower, not from sadness, but from sheer exhaustion. My body ached in strange ways, too much crouching, too many hours sitting cross-legged on rugs that smelled faintly of Cheerios and apple juice. And always, always the echoes of other people's voices in my ears. You're too smart to be wasting time babysitting. You're good with kids, but that's not a real job. When are you going to do something for yourself? What they didn't understand was that this was for myself. Not the work itself, maybe, but the way it was showing me who I was. I wasn't just soothing tantrums. I was decoding human behavior. I wasn't just filling in for overwhelmed parents. I was mapping an entire broken system. Every hour I spent building pillow forts or managing meltdowns was another hour spent refining a future platform's needs. I knew what features mattered. I knew where trust lived. I knew how fragile and sacred the space between parent and caregiver really was. I didn't want to build an app that streamlined babysitting. I wanted to build a solution that restored dignity to caregivers, to parents, to the entire chaotic dance of modern family life. I wanted to create something rooted in empathy and powered by reliability. And somewhere deep inside I knew I could. I just didn't know when. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal shift involving a spilled smoothie, a lost pet frog, and a mother sobbing into her blazer before a Zoom call, I sat alone in the backyard as the sun started to dip. My hands smelled like soap and strawberries, and my legs were streaked with sidewalk chalk. I looked down at myself and saw someone no investor would ever take seriously. But I also saw someone who knew things most founders didn't. I knew how to hold chaos, how to earn trust without a pitch, how to listen before offering solutions. I wasn't a babysitter, I was an operator waiting for her launch window. And it was coming. It happened on a Thursday. Nothing dramatic, no blowout argument or major breakthrough, just a small moment, almost forgettable, but it changed everything. I was helping Olivia, a 5-year-old with curly hair and a fear of loud noises, pack her backpack for preschool. Her mother, Dana, was pacing in the kitchen, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, her free hand scanning an email on her laptop while she reheated coffee in the microwave for the 3rd time that morning. Olivia was quietly stacking her crayons by color while I zipped up her coat, and Dana was juggling 2 meetings, 1 meltdown, and no margin for error. She hung up the call and sighed like someone had stolen the air from her lungs. "I just need 1 normal week," she muttered. Then, louder, almost to herself, "Or a clone. Or a wife." I didn't laugh. I just stood there and watched her crumble in real time, perfect nails, sharp suit, mascara smudged under her left eye, and this unmistakable look of someone trying to hold up 5 walls with 2 hands. It wasn't new. I'd seen that look on dozens of parents. But for some reason, in that moment, I saw it differently. Not as part of my job. Not as something to help absorb. I saw it as a system failure. And for the first time, I thought, this isn't about bad planning or tired parents. This is about infrastructure. I walked Olivia out to the car and strapped her in while Dana took another call, already snapping into her professional voice. When she pulled out of the driveway with one hand still on her Bluetooth earpiece, I just stood there on the curb, blinking against the morning sun. And I couldn't unsee it. We've spent years building apps to deliver groceries in 15 minutes, algorithms to recommend our next purchase, platforms to optimize every inch of productivity. And yet the average working parent still duct tapes their week together with desperate texts to sitters and fingers crossed that no one gets sick. There were childcare centers with wait lists, longer than college admissions, and yet no trusted way to match real-time, qualified, emotionally intelligent help with real families who needed flexibility and compassion, not just availability. I went back inside and sat at Dana's kitchen table. The sticky note she left for herself was still there. Remember, get milk, call accountant, print forms, send check. None of it sounded hard, yet she hadn't done any of it. Because parenting wasn't hard in isolation, it was hard because of its velocity, its stacking demands, and the total lack of structured, integrated support. I stared at that note like it was a roadmap to a blind spot. Then I started scribbling. I filled a sheet of paper with a list of things I knew firsthand, what parents were really asking for when they said flexible, what red flags made them cancel a caregiver, what made them trust me more than a platform, what tools would have helped me plan better, communicate better, rest more. I wrote until my hand cramped, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to the needs of the day. I was starting to trace the shape of a real solution. That night, I dug out an old notebook I'd been saving, the one with the thick paper and the navy blue cover I bought years ago. Just in case. I wrote at the top of the first page, Care Loop Notes. I didn't know what Care Loop was yet. I just liked the name. It sounded like something that closed gaps, something circular. Safe, dynamic. I wrote down 3 questions. What does quality care look like across income levels? What do caregivers need to feel respected and empowered? How do we make both sides feel like partners, not placeholders? It felt like nothing and everything all at once. I wasn't trying to become a founder. I didn't even know if I wanted to. I was just trying to make sense of a world that was breaking good people slowly and calling it parenting. The next few weeks, I started logging patterns. I created a spreadsheet not for payroll, but for pain points. I tracked cancellations, breakdowns, logistical friction. I wrote quotes I overheard from exhausted moms, frustrated dads, overwhelmed grandparents. I tracked how long it took to find backup care when someone was sick. I noted how often I was asked to do tasks that weren't on paper emotional labor, social translation, invisible management of space and routine. I saw the gap, and I couldn't unsee it. It wasn't just that families needed help, it was that they needed help that didn't treat them like transactions. And caregivers needed support that didn't reduce them to warm bodies with CPR cards. The existing tools weren't wrong, they were just empty. They solved the wrong problem. And they did it without listening. I began to imagine something else. Not just a marketplace, a framework. Not just listings, relationships. Not just efficiency, humanity. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But inside me, something had shifted. The same way a child goes from babbling to suddenly saying full sentences, the noise in my mind had started forming shape, coherence, meaning. I wasn't building slides or wireframes. I was listening, I was noticing. And it turns out, that's where everything starts. It started with index cards. Nothing fancy. Just scraps of paper I kept in my tote bag, wedged between wipes and sippy cups. Whenever something stood out, a conversation, a logistical failure, a look in a parent's eyes, I'd jot it down while a toddler stacked blocks or nibbled on graham crackers nearby. I had no plan yet, just fragments. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't imagining a business, I was observing one that already existed, only no one had given it a name. The real shift came when I began organizing the notes by problem, not anecdote. I wasn't just logging frustrations, I was clustering them. Gaps in scheduling, unclear expectations, trust breakdowns, burnout among both parents and caregivers. I saw that everything I had been smoothing over for years was actually a blueprint for a new kind of system, not just to match people, but to build partnerships. And once that thought clicked into place, I couldn't stop. I'd sit in the park while the kids ran toward the swings, scribbling outlines for user flows on the back of napkins. I'd draft wireframes in the margins of bedtime storybooks. I read blog posts from Y Combinator while folding laundry, watched pitch videos during snack prep, and listened to business podcasts on one earbud while pushing strollers. It was messy, imperfect, fragmented, but it was building. At night, I started sketching what a platform could look like. I didn't know how to design a real app, but I could describe what it needed to do. A dashboard that let caregivers log emotional check-ins. A messaging tool that wasn't cold or transactional but encouraged real updates. An onboarding process that didn't just vet qualifications, but measured values, styles, temperament. I wanted to build a space where the emotional intelligence of care was valued as much as certifications. The tools on the market felt sterile. Marketplace platforms that offered background checks and reviews, but no context, no flexibility, no soul. Parents scrolled endlessly through profiles that all blurred together. Caregivers felt commodified. It was like trying to find a friend through a resume. I knew what it could be instead. Something smaller, smarter, grounded in trust. I didn't want to build a corporation. I wanted to build a loop. I called it Care Loop. I started playing with the idea of pitching it not to investors, not yet, but to myself. I needed to prove I could say it out loud. So I stood in front of my bathroom mirror one night, still in my work clothes, mascara smudged, and I tried. I spoke the words like I was introducing someone I wasn't sure I had the right to believe in yet. Hi, I'm Clara Monroe. I'm the founder of CareLoop, a platform that reimagines caregiver-parent partnerships through personalized support, trust-building systems, and emotional context. It sounded ridiculous, and true. I stumbled over the words at first, but then I said it again, and again, until it stopped feeling like a joke and started feeling like a promise. I signed up for a free community workshop on startup basics at a co-working space downtown. I went in my work shoes, still flecked with Play-Doh. Everyone else had laptops. I had my notebook. Everyone else talked about market size and MVPs. I wrote down acronyms and looked them up later in bed. No one looked at me twice. I was invisible. But I didn't care, because every sentence I heard confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't crazy. The gap I'd been seeing wasn't imaginary. It was a business opportunity. The instructor mentioned pitch decks, how founders needed to tell a story in 10 slides or less. I nearly laughed. 10 slides? I had lived the story for 10 years, but I went home and started building it anyway. I opened Google Slides and titled it CareLoop Redesigning Trust. Slide 1, the problem. Slide 2, the parents. Slide 3, the caregivers. Slide 4, the gap. Slide 5, the system. Slide 6, the solution. Slide 7, the loop. Slide 8, early response. Slide 9, revenue model. Slide 10, vision. I didn't have numbers yet, but I had clarity. And then something strange happened. One of the moms I worked for, Jenna, a tech recruiter, saw me reading the mom test while the baby napped. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You building something?" I paused. Then I nodded, trying to. She didn't laugh, didn't condescend. She asked, "Need someone to test your questions?" That night, I interviewed her like a user. She was my first. Then came others, moms, dads, fellow sitters, preschool directors. I called them conversations, but they were more like excavations. Each one confirmed what I feared and hoped. The need was real. I refined the deck. I mocked up wireframes in Canva. I built a survey and collected feedback. I watched a YouTube video 10 times until I figured out how to map a user journey. I wasn't moving fast, but I was moving. The playground had been my classroom. Now it was my lab. And slowly, slide by slide, question by question, the girl who once sat quietly at the edge of the family dinner table was turning the chaos she'd mastered into a structure no one else had built. Not yet. But I would. It always happened the same way. Julia entered a room like a breaking news alert, heels sharp, phone in hand, blazer draped over her shoulders like a crown. She didn't announce herself. She didn't have to. The room bent to accommodate her presence before she even spoke. That day, the gathering was meant to be casual, just family, just brunch. But Julia didn't do casual. She arrived late, flanked by someone new, a boyfriend or colleague or client. I never quite caught his name. What I did catch was the way my mother's posture straightened as soon as Julia crossed the threshold, the way my father stood from his seat and offered her the better chair without hesitation. I was already there, as usual. Early, helping set the table, taking scones out of the oven, making sure the kids had quiet activities lined up so the adults could have their grown-up time. I didn't mind. I'd always known my role in these situations: quiet support, smiling face, the one who refills water glasses and keeps conversations from fraying when the tension between relatives becomes too obvious. Julia was glowing. She had that rehearsed brightness that sparkled on cue, an expensive kind of charm that made people lean in and believe they were lucky just to be near it. She dropped into the seat at the head of the table and casually mentioned she had just incorporated a company, something about financial wellness for General Z. My parents lit up. My aunt clapped her hands together. Someone asked, "Is this the startup you mentioned in Aspen?" And Julia nodded like a benevolent monarch blessing her court. Then she said it. Honestly, it just made sense. Everyone's trying to do these fluffy little side projects. I figured, why not build something real? My spine stiffened before my brain caught up. I was across the table, half listening while slicing strawberries, but my hands paused mid-motion. Fluffy little side projects. It wasn't directed at me. Not technically. But the words floated across the table like a dart, feathered with condescension, sharp enough to find skin. No one else noticed. Or if they did, they didn't flinch. She continued talking about onboarding engineers, pitching to angel investors, her upcoming trip to the valley. She was building something with scale, something that mattered. And I, sitting in a linen apron with berry juice on my fingers, became once again the supporting act in someone else's origin story. I didn't speak. Not because I didn't have words, but because I knew they wouldn't land. Not here. Not yet. I simply smiled and nodded and passed the plate of fruit across the table like I hadn't just been publicly shrunk. Later, as people filtered out and the kitchen filled with clinking plates and leftover pastries, I stood at the sink rinsing mugs. Julia walked in behind me, heels clicking softly on the tile. "You're good at this," she said. I couldn't see her face, but I could hear the smirk behind it. "You could open a catering business or something. People love that domestic stuff." I didn't answer right away. I turned off the water, dried my hands slowly, deliberately. Then I looked at her and said the only thing I could think to say. "Already building something." She raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" I nodded. "That's cute," she said, her voice lilting just enough to land the second blow. Then she walked away. I stood there for a long moment after she left the room. Not angry. Not even hurt. Just clear. The kind of clarity that arrives after the sting, when the blood returns to your limbs and you realize, no, this isn't surprise anymore. It's recognition. Julia had always needed to believe that what she did was big because it made her feel small to imagine otherwise. She needed me to stay the helper, the sweet one, the babysitter. Because if I stepped outside that role, if I dared to build something real, then her mirror cracked. But I wasn't building to compete with her. I was building because I saw something broken. That night, I went home and opened my laptop. I revised my deck. I updated my pain point matrix. I added 3 new user testimonials I'd gathered. I reworked my positioning statement until it felt sharp enough to say out loud in any room. Then I did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I filed the LLC paperwork for CareLoop. It wasn't vengeance, it wasn't even defiance, it was alignment. Like snapping a puzzle piece into place and realizing the picture was always there, waiting for you to stop pretending you didn't see it. Julia's words weren't a wall anymore. They were a marker. She'd thrown the second blow. And this time, I didn't flinch. I built. The day I filed my LLC papers for CareLoop, I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not the families I worked for. Not even my best friend. It felt like lighting a match in the dark, not to burn anything down, but to quietly confirm that I wasn't imagining the room. I printed the confirmation email, folded it in half, and tucked it between the pages of my notebook like a pressed flower. It wasn't a funding round or a viral launch, but it was real. I had taken the first step, a small one, but mine. I didn't quit caregiving, I couldn't afford to. But I started structuring my days around the build. Nap times became design sessions. Playground hours doubled as user interviews. I kept refining the deck, iterating on features, reading obsessively about other founders who had started from nothing but clarity and grit. My time wasn't linear. It folded around the needs of others, but I learned to use the cracks. The turning point came when I met Tasha. She was a single mom with a 3-year-old named Rami, and we met at a public library play session. I had been helping a family with 3 kids and was wrangling a toddler meltdown when I noticed her watching me with that look, part admiration, part exhaustion, part quiet hope. After the kids settled, we started talking. She was brilliant. She had worked in UX design before becoming a full-time parent. She told me, almost offhandedly, that she missed working with systems. I told her I was building one. 3 weeks later, she was my co-founder. We didn't have money. We had momentum. Tasha took my notes and mock-ups and turned them into clickable prototypes. I took her wireframes and ran them past every parent I knew. We created surveys, mapped stress points, built a wait list of families who didn't just want a babysitter, they wanted a partner. Someone who got it. Someone who showed up. We spent evenings on Zoom, muted during bedtime routines, screen sharing while nursing or meal prepping. It was messy, imperfect, scrappy, but it was alive. We named each early version of the app after trees. The first one, Birch, was barely functional but rooted. Maple had a smoother dashboard. Oak had onboarding flows that made people say, "Oh wow, I feel seen." I applied to a local startup accelerator for women-led businesses. We didn't expect to get in. But I wrote the application like it was a letter to the version of myself who had once sat quietly at family dinners, invisible behind dessert trays. I told the truth. About burnout. About gaps. About dignity. I described our mission not in terms of disruption, but restoration. We weren't breaking the system. We were building the one it should have been all along. They accepted us. We cried. Ugly, exhausted, relieved tears. Because for the first time, someone outside of the caregiving bubble had looked at what we were building and said, yes, this matters. The accelerator gave us office space, mentorship, Slack channels full of acronyms we didn't understand at first but Googled relentlessly. They taught us how to talk to investors, how to define metrics, how to pitch without apologizing. In the second week, we did a mock pitch night. Each founder had to present in front of a panel and get real-time feedback. I wore a borrowed blazer and shoes that pinched my heels. My voice shook for the first 10 seconds. Then I saw a woman in the back nodding when I said, "There's no such thing as just a babysitter." After that, I found my footing. They told us to prepare for rejection. To hear no 50 times before the first yes. So when I sent our deck to 5 angels and 3 wrote back wanting to talk, I almost didn't believe it. We met with one investor in a coffee shop where I used to take toddlers for juice boxes. This time, I ordered a black coffee and walked him through our traction numbers on my tablet. He asked smart questions. I had answers. He committed $25,000 on the spot. It wasn't a huge check, but it felt like seed and soil all at once. With that money, we hired a part-time developer and paid ourselves barely enough to breathe. We didn't scale. We deepened. We ran a pilot with 10 families, then 20. We built our own onboarding rubric based on values alignment. We said no to parents who wanted someone on call without fair pay. We trained our caregivers not just in CPR, but in communication, boundary setting, burnout awareness. We were building something that didn't exist in metrics yet, but pulsed like a heartbeat. My parents still didn't quite get it. My dad asked if we were running a daycare. My mom sent me articles about teacher shortages and wondered if I wanted to go back to school. I nodded, smiled, filed it all under, "They'll see later." Julia didn't ask. She was busy with her startup, some app about freelance budgeting, I think. I saw a post about it on LinkedIn. Glossy branding, buzzwords, a launch party with neon signage and flat champagne. Our paths hadn't crossed in months, but I could feel it. We were getting close. CareLoop wasn't big, but it was strong. The roots were deep. The branches were growing. We didn't have a viral launch or a fancy PR team. But every day, another parent told us, "This changed how I feel about asking for help." And that's what we were really doing. Changing how people ask for help and how they're met when they do. Seed and soil, that's how things grow. There was a time when I measured my worth by the reactions around the dinner table. A raised eyebrow from Julia. A tight-lipped smile from my mother. A dismissive nod from an uncle who thought startups were for bored housewives. I used to walk into those family gatherings armed with invisible hope that maybe this time someone would ask what I was working on and really listen. That maybe they'd be curious instead of amused. I don't remember when exactly that hope started to die, but I do remember the moment I realized I didn't need it anymore. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind that used to be filled with pickup schedules and after-school snack prep. But now I was sitting in a co-working space that smelled like espresso and ambition, staring at my calendar and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Capacity. Not the kind that comes from time, but the kind that comes from control. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. CareLoop had just onboarded its 50th caregiver. We were still small, still scrappy, but something had shifted. The systems we'd built were working. Families were referring us to other families without prompting. We had our first partnership with a local employer who wanted to offer caregiver access as a benefit. I was spending less time explaining why we mattered and more time improving how we worked. And people were noticing. Not my family, not yet, but people who mattered in different ways. A mother who cried on the phone because she felt seen for the first time. A caregiver who said our platform made her feel like a professional, not a placeholder. An investor who emailed us out of the blue, saying he'd heard about us from 2 different founders at a brunch. The silence from home became less painful. It became irrelevant. I didn't bring up the business at gatherings anymore, not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer needed their validation. If someone asked, I told them. If they didn't, I let them talk about real estate and vacation homes and how Julia's company had been profiled in a local magazine. I nodded and smiled and passed the salad bowl like one hadn't just spent the week negotiating a pilot with a public school district. One afternoon, Julia posted a photo of herself on LinkedIn standing in front of a whiteboard covered in diagrams and sticky notes. The caption read, "Building what others only talk about." It got hundreds of likes. I scrolled past it without reaction. Not because it didn't sting, but because it no longer reached deep enough to wound me. I wasn't building in opposition to her anymore. I was building in alignment with myself. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak on a virtual panel for women founders in care infrastructure. It wasn't a big event, maybe 200 attendees, but it felt monumental to me. I told a story about the first meltdown I navigated as a caregiver, and how that moment taught me more about crisis management than any textbook. I watched the chat light up with nods, with resonance. Afterward, one attendee messaged me privately. "You made me feel proud of the work I've been ashamed to name." That's when it hit me. I wasn't just creating a product, I was creating language. Legitimacy. A mirror where others could see their work, their care, their effort not as fallback jobs or temporary roles, but as expertise, as leadership. And I didn't need Julia to clap for that. There's a freedom that comes when you stop auditioning. When you let go of the fantasy that one perfectly phrased update will finally earn you a seat at a table that never had space for your kind of brilliance. I stopped trying to make CareLoop sound impressive in family terms. I stopped explaining what pre-seed traction meant or why our churn rate was low. I stopped translating. Instead, I built. I hired a part-time operations coordinator, someone I met through one of our earliest pilot families. I booked a consultation with a startup attorney. I revised our founder agreement with Tasha to make sure equity was split in a way that honored the invisible labor we both brought into the company. I sent a handwritten thank you note to our first angel investor, with a quarterly update enclosed. I found rhythm. Not balance exactly, but a kind of clarity. The weight of each day felt different when it came from purpose, not performance. Not on a random Tuesday, while walking past a dry cleaner's on my way to a meeting, I realized something else. I hadn't thought about my sister in days. Not with envy. Not with comparison. Not at all. That absence wasn't hollow, it was peace. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to the family who still called what I did child stuff. Not to the investors who once asked if I was just solving a personal problem. Not to the part of me that used to shrink under a single raised eyebrow. I had outgrown them all. And when you outgrow something, you don't need to fight it. You just keep walking. You keep building. You keep becoming. And one day, you turn around and realize you never needed their map. You were always meant to draw your own. The office wasn't big. Just 2 small rooms at the end of a quiet hallway inside a converted warehouse that now housed startups, yoga studios, and overpriced coffee shops. But it had our name on the door, CareLoop, in matte silver lettering right above a chipped black handle and beside a potted plant I kept forgetting to water. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. Every single morning. I paused there like it was a checkpoint, a reminder, a breath. My name wasn't on the door literally, but it was in the bones of everything behind it. It had taken almost a year to get here. A year of working out of cafes, public libraries, and Tasha's kitchen table. A year of late-night Slack threads and Google Drive folders with half-finished pitch decks and mock-ups labeled final_V3. A year of hoping each check would clear before payroll and whispering imposter syndrome into silence when it knocked. And now we had walls. A whiteboard. A mini fridge. Chairs that didn't fold. We moved in on a Saturday. Tasha brought her son, who fell asleep on a beanbag while we assembled the IKEA desk. I lit a candle we weren't supposed to have. It smelled like bergamot and eucalyptus and ambition. We didn't do a ribbon cutting or an Instagram post. We just unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and got to work. And it felt different. Not because the space made us legitimate, but because we no longer needed legitimacy to feel real. We had traction. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that mattered. Caregivers were sticking with us. Families were telling their friends. Our early churn had flattened. A local podcast had mentioned us. An HR director from a mid-sized tech company requested a meeting to discuss integrating CareLoop as a benefit. And then the email came. It was from the Accelerator's partnership coordinator. A new cohort of early-stage founders was coming in, and they were looking for alumni to serve as panelists during the pitch practice week. Founders who had, quote, launched, grown, and maintained values-driven traction. I read the line twice, then a third time. It was generic and glowing and real. They wanted me to be on the other side of the table. I said yes before I had time to overthink it. When the day came, I arrived early. I wore a blazer I'd thrifted months ago and never had the confidence to wear. The pockets were still stitched shut. I stood outside the panel room for a moment, listening to the low hum of voices and chairs being arranged. And I felt something I hadn't in years, nervousness not rooted in doubt, but in scale. I wasn't trying to prove myself. I was representing something bigger than me. A story. A system. A possibility. The panel started, and I introduced myself last. I'm Clara Monroe, co-founder of CareLoop, I said. We focus on building trust-centered infrastructure for modern caregiving partnerships. No jokes. No disclaimers. Just facts. I saw a few heads nod. I saw a few eyes widen. And I felt the quiet shift again that moment when someone realizes you're not the person they assumed. Founder after founder pitched. Some were brilliant, some not ready. I listened, asked questions, offered gentle notes. I recognized the look in their eyes, the hunger, the tightness in their throats when they said their startup names aloud. Still unsure, they had the right to own something with a future. And then the door opened again. I didn't look up right away. I was writing something down, circling a line in someone's deck about onboarding strategy. But the air changed. Not in a dramatic way, just enough for the hair on my arms to rise before my brain registered why. Her voice hit me first. Julia. Polished, confident, a little too loud for the space. I'm here for the 3:45 pitch slot, she said. I looked up. She didn't see me at first. She was too busy adjusting her blazer, introducing her co-founder, scanning the room for someone important. Then her eyes landed on me. She didn't flinch. Not exactly, but her smile stuttered. The corners of her mouth dipped for half a second before she recovered. I nodded. Professional. Neutral. I didn't smile. The moderator invited her to begin. Her deck was sleek, visually impressive. Their product was a platform to optimize freelance hiring workflows through some kind of behavioral AI matching. I'd heard the pitch before, in different words. The kind of thing that sounded good at cocktail parties but didn't solve pain. It chased trends. I listened. Took notes. Waited. When she finished, the moderator turned to the panel. Clara, want to start? She looked at me, then really looked. And for a moment, I saw it. Not shame, not fear, just confusion. A silent processing of the fact that I was the one asking questions now. I leaned forward slightly. Interesting concept, I said. Can you walk me through your user acquisition strategy? Specifically, how you're planning to differentiate yourself from existing platforms already solving for top-of-funnel friction. Her co-founder blinked. Julia hesitated, then spoke. The answer was vague, fluffed, circular. I followed up. And on the revenue side, what's your projected burn versus your CAC over the next 2 quarters? She faltered again. This time, visibly. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just took notes. The panel ended. The founders exited. And Julia walked past my chair without a word. Her eyes met mine for a second. I held her gaze. Steady. Not cruel. Just clear. She didn't speak. I didn't need her to. Her name was on a slide. Mine was on the door. The lobby was unusually quiet that morning. The kind of stillness that happens just after a cleaning crew leaves, and before the first wave of caffeine-chasing founders rushes in. I liked that silence. It gave me a moment to breathe before the meetings began. I stood by the coffee machine, waiting for it to sputter out the last few drops of someone else's espresso, and scrolled through emails, half-reading calendar reminders, and unread investor updates. My focus was soft, mind already in motion, rehearsing talking points for the onboarding workshop I was about to lead upstairs. Then I heard my name. Not out loud, no one called it, but internally, like a bell that suddenly rang in my chest for no clear reason. I looked up, and there she was, Julia. She was standing at the check-in desk, talking to the receptionist. Her coat was impeccable, cream-colored and belted, the kind of piece that screamed understated money. Her hair was pulled into a neat high twist, and she wore heels just a little too loud for the concrete floors. I hadn't seen her in person since the panel. That day, she'd exited the room with her jaw set and her mouth shut, offering no acknowledgement, no follow-up, not even a cold email. I assumed we'd both let it lie. Apparently, I was wrong. Her voice floated across the lobby as she confirmed her time slot. She was here for a second meeting. Not with me, but in the same building, same floor, same accelerator. A follow-up pitch, most likely. That meant she was still fundraising, still knocking on doors, still trying to frame what she was building as something solid enough to back. I stood still for a moment, coffee in hand, wondering if she'd noticed me yet. I hadn't moved. Part of me wanted to turn away, to avoid the awkwardness, to preserve the hard-earned peace I'd built since disentangling my identity from her approval. But another part of me, the quieter, stronger part, knew I didn't need to avoid anything. I didn't owe her distance. I didn't owe her comfort. I walked toward the elevator. As I passed, she turned. We locked eyes. Her reaction wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no confrontation, just a moment of paused breath. Her smile came quickly reflexive, professional, too tight at the edges. She gave a small nod, the kind you give someone you know but aren't sure how to greet anymore. Clara, she said. Just my name. I stopped, not out of courtesy but choice. I looked her in the eye and returned the nod. Morning. It hung there, awkward and brittle. She glanced down at her phone, then back at me. Didn't know you were still based here. I'm not. Just here for a workshop. My voice was calm, even. I didn't ask what she was doing. She knew I knew. The receptionist handed her a badge. Room B4. You can head up. She thanked her and hesitated, like she wanted to say more. Then thought better of it. I stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed. And I exhaled. Not from anxiety. Not from relief. From recognition. For years, my relationship to Julia had been one of orbit. She was the sun, and I revolved quietly, trying not to burn. But in that lobby, for the first time, we stood side by side in the same gravity. And she looked uncertain. Not because I had done anything to make her feel that way, but because I no longer needed her light. Upstairs, the workshop began. I spoke to a room full of first-time founders about user discovery, about the power of slow traction, about the importance of solving real problems with patience and precision. I didn't mention my sister. I didn't need to. That story wasn't relevant anymore. But when I looked at the name tags during the next round of mentor matches, I spotted it again. Julia Monroe, printed in sans serif, clipped to a lanyard like everyone else. And I smiled. Because there was something poetic about that. About her being in the same space I had once entered nervously, quietly, invisibly. About her now waiting for meetings, hoping for interest, just as I had once hoped. And about how it no longer rattled me to see her there. That evening, as I packed my bag to leave, I passed by the check-in desk again. Her badge was gone. So was she. But in the sign-in log, one line above hers was mine. Different names. Same building, different stories, same map. Except now, I knew exactly which room was mine. I didn't plan to be in the room when Julia pitched again. The meeting wasn't on my calendar. I had handed off most of the founder mentorship sessions to my operations lead so I could focus on expansion. We were in talks with a school district on the East Coast, and I had been knee-deep in logistics, compliance documents, and time zone math. But when the call came through from the accelerator coordinator, "One of the panels is short a lead reviewer, can you fill in?" I said yes, without hesitation. Not out of curiosity. Not out of ego. But because the phase of flinching at Julia's name had passed. The only thing that mattered now was the pitch. The room was a familiar one. Whiteboard on one wall, a long table in the middle, pitchers of water sweating beside a tray of protein bars no one touched. A few other panelists settled in, flipping through printouts and adjusting their posture for the performative attentiveness we'd all perfected. I took the seat closest to the window, opened my notebook, and glanced at the schedule. Her name was third. When the door opened and she stepped inside, I saw it again. The brief falter in her eyes, the second of hesitation that passed before she reset her face into neutral professionalism. She was wearing gray this time, softer than her usual blacks and creams. Her hair was looser. Her eyes darted around the table as she introduced herself. She didn't acknowledge me. I didn't expect her to. The pitch began. Same deck structure as before. Clean, glossy, but thinner now. A few pivots since the last time I'd seen it. The company had rebranded, now focused less on behavioral AI for freelancers and more on streamlined hiring pipelines for hybrid teams. It was smart, on trend, polished, but hollow. Each slide felt like a performance, carefully tuned to buzzwords without touching ground. I watched the other panelists nod along. One of them asked about the TAM, the total addressable market, and Julia answered with practiced ease. Another asked about her team. She spoke confidently about her co-founder, an engineer she'd met through a fellowship program. Their dynamic seemed solid. She knew how to lead a room. That had never been the problem. When it came time for my questions, I didn't hesitate. I asked about retention, about how they plan to keep clients after the first month. I asked about user feedback, what pain points users were expressing that the product hadn't solved yet. I asked about churn, not in percentages, but in behavior. What happened when people left? What did they say? Julia paused. Just for a second. Then she answered. Vaguely. I didn't press. Because I wasn't there to dismantle her. I was there to measure viability. And the truth was, the product wasn't ready. Not for this stage. Not for real traction. It was still early. Still cosmetic. It needed refining, not funding. Direction, not dollars. The moderator turned to the panel for feedback. The first reviewer gave a soft pass. Interesting. Early. Would love to see deeper data. The second echoed it. Promising, but not quite there yet. Then it was my turn. I looked at Julia not with anger, not with condescension, but with clarity. I think you're solving something people care about, I said. But right now it feels like the problem is still being defined. I'd encourage you to dig deeper into your users' behavior, not just their words. What people say they need and what they actually use can be two very different things. She nodded, her lips tight. I continued. Also, think about building smaller before scaling bigger. There's power in becoming indispensable to a niche before trying to reach everyone. The room was quiet for a second. Then the moderator thanked her and moved on. She gathered her laptop, her bag, her composure. As she turned to leave, she looked at me for just a beat longer than necessary. There was no smirk this time, no dig, no defensiveness, only something like understanding. Outside, In the hallway, I sat alone for a moment after the session ended. I wasn't buzzing, I wasn't relieved, I wasn't anything, really. And that's how I knew I'd made it. Not because I'd bested her, but because I no longer needed to. There was no bitterness in the way I asked my questions, no pettiness in the feedback, no performative grace to make a point. Just business. Just one founder assessing another. Later that week, I received a message from one of the newer accelerator members. She had sat in on the panel and thanked me for my feedback. "You asked the kind of questions I wish people would ask me," she wrote. "Not to poke holes, but to make me better. That's what I'd always wanted. To build something real, something lasting, not applause, not revenge, just work that mattered." And in that room, that day, I saw how far I'd come. Not by proving anything to Julia, but by never needing to again. The email wasn't flashy. No bold subject line, no urgent request. Just a short, polite message from the head of people operations at a mid-sized tech company. They were expanding benefits for working parents and wanted to schedule a call about what CareLoop might offer their team. I stared at the screen for a long moment, rereading the words. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they were so normal. Routine. Like our work had become assumed, expected, woven into the world in a way I used to dream about. I clicked reply and set the meeting. Later that morning, I walked through the neighborhood where I used to nanny past the old brick houses with pastel bikes on porches and sidewalk chalk still ghosted on the pavement. I'd once spent every afternoon here, pushing strollers and carrying snacks in Ziploc bags, wiping noses and quietly tucking in notes of encouragement to overwhelmed mothers. Now I walked past those same houses in heels, with a laptop in my bag instead of wipes. It felt surreal, familiar, and entirely new. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in a shop window, not because I was checking my appearance, but because something about the silhouette startled me. It wasn't just that I looked older, it was that I looked steady, not hurried, not crumpled under the weight of someone else's needs, just centered. I didn't flinch at my own reflection anymore. The next day, I hosted a community session at the CareLoop office. We did those monthly now, a space for parents and caregivers to meet in person, share stories, swap tips. No pressure, just connection. One of the moms brought homemade muffins. A sitter showed up in her graduation cap because she'd just completed her nursing degree and wanted to celebrate with the families who supported her through night school. I stood in the corner, sipping tea, watching them all, and realized no one was looking to me for direction. The system worked without my hand on every lever. The loop was alive. A little girl tugged on my sleeve. I turned and smiled. "Are you the boss?" she asked, eyes wide. I crouched down to her level. "Something like that." She nodded, serious. "You look like a boss." Her mom laughed from behind her. "She's been playing Office all morning." I looked at the girl's tiny clipboard, her sticker-covered notepad, her fierce, focused energy. "Well," I said, "you've got the most important part already, listening." She grinned and ran off to join a group building a city out of foam blocks and construction paper. I watched as they huddled, planned, adjusted. No one shouted. Everyone had a role. They weren't trying to lead, they were trying to build something that stayed standing when they stepped away. That, I thought, is leadership. Later that evening, back at home, I opened my personal inbox and found a photo from Tasha. It was from our first week working together. The photo showed our prototype drawn in Sharpie on a piece of butcher paper taped to her kitchen wall. In the background, her son was asleep on the couch, crayons scattered around him. The caption read, "Can you believe we built this thing?" I stared at it, tears rising unexpectedly. Not from sadness, not even joy, just the quiet ache of recognition, of seeing a version of yourself you almost forgot, the one who dared to believe without proof. That night, I printed the photo and pinned it above my desk. The next morning, I arrived early to the office. The city was still stretching, blinking awake. I turned the key, pushed open the door, and stepped into the stillness of a space we had earned inch by inch. The walls weren't fancy. The furniture didn't match. But everything in that room had come from intention, not accident. I walked to the window and looked out at the school across the street. Parents hurried through drop-off. Children clung to sleeves, kissed cheeks, let go. I watched one mother exhale deeply as she stepped back into her car, and I thought of all the versions of myself I'd been. The babysitter, the helper, the invisible girl at the family table, the amateur with a dream and a borrowed blazer. And now, I didn't need the title. But if someone asked, I'd answer clearly. I'm the chairwoman of the playroom. And we are building an empire, one block, one question, one act of care at a time.